The afternoon sun filtered through the ancient oak trees surrounding Meadowbank House, casting dappled shadows across the immaculate lawn where the street Mary Mead Garden Society's annual charity tea had reached its most convivial hour. Miss Jane Marple sat comfortably in a wicker chair beneath the rose arbor, her knitting needles moving with practiced rhythm, while her pale blue eyes observed the gentle social ballet unfolding before her. Mrs. Hermione Blackwood, the Society's recently elected president, presided over the festivities with the confident authority of someone accustomed to command. Her prized possession, a magnificent scarlet teapot of unusual design, occupied the place of honor at the center of the white linen-draped table. The piece was striking in its bold coloring, a vivid crimson that seemed to glow like a jewel among the delicate spode china surrounding it. 18th century, you know, Mrs. Blackwood announced to anyone within earshot, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone displaying a treasured heirloom. Belonged to my dear late husband's grandmother. Quite irreplaceable, I'm told. Miss Marple's attention wandered across the assembled company with the quiet interest of someone who had spent decades observing human nature in all its fascinating complexity. Young Dr. Pemberton, recently arrived from London to take over old Dr. Haydock's practice, hovered uncertainly near the tea table, clearly eager to make a good impression. Mrs. Gladys Fortescue, the postmistress, whispered animatedly with her sister about some village scandal, their heads bent together like conspirators. Captain Weatherby, retired from the Indian Army and perpetually nostalgic for more adventurous days, examined the roses with the critical eye of a man who found civilian life rather tame. The newcomer to the village, Miss Prudence Hartwell, stood somewhat apart from the main gathering. She had inherited Ivy Cottage from a distant aunt and had arrived only 3 weeks prior, bringing with her an air of mysterious reserve that had already set tongues wagging. Her artistic sensibilities were evident in her careful study of Mrs. Blackwood's Scarlet Teapot, which she regarded with the intensity of a connoisseur. "Such an unusual glaze," Miss Hartwell murmured, accepting a cup from Mrs. Blackwood's carefully gloved hands. "The color is quite extraordinary. I dabble in ceramics myself, you understand." Blackwood's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes? Well, one doesn't often see such quality in modern pieces, does one? This particular pot has been in the family for generations." The vicar, Reverend Clement, moved graciously among the guests with his wife Leonard at his side, both radiating the practiced charm that came from years of parish social events. Colonel Melchett, the chief constable, engaged in spirited debate with Major Palgrave about the declining standards of modern youth, their voices mixing with the gentle murmur of village gossip and the soft clink of china. Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Blackwood kept one eye constantly on her precious teapot, her movements becoming slightly tense whenever anyone approached too closely. There was something almost possessive in the way she handled the piece, as though it represented more than mere family sentiment. The church clock had just chimed 4:30 when Captain Weatherby approached the tea table with his characteristic military bearing. "I say, Mrs. Blackwood, might I trouble you for another cup? That special blend of yours is absolutely first-rate." Mrs. Blackwood beamed with pleasure as she lifted the scarlet teapot, the afternoon light catching its glossy surface. "Of course, Captain. This particular tea is a family recipe, quite exclusive, you understand." The captain accepted his cup with a gallant bow and took an appreciative sip. For a moment, his weathered face registered surprise. Then, something approaching alarm. His hand went instinctively to his throat, the teacup rattling against its saucer as his grip faltered. "I say," he began, then stopped abruptly, his eyes widening in unmistakable distress. The cup slipped from his fingers, shattering against the flagstones as Captain Weatherby swayed dangerously and collapsed onto the pristine lawn, his face already turning an ominous shade of blue. The scarlet teapot stood gleaming in the sudden, terrible silence. The shattered teacup seemed to echo endlessly in the sudden, terrible silence that followed Captain Weatherby's collapse. For a heartbeat, the assembled guests stood frozen like figures in a pastoral painting, their faces registering the slow comprehension that something dreadful had just occurred before their very eyes. Dr. Pemberton was the first to move, his medical training overriding social propriety as he dropped to his knees beside the captain's still form. His young hands worked with practiced efficiency, checking for pulse and breathing, though the peculiar blue tinge already spreading across the captain's weathered features suggested the futility of such efforts. "Stand back, please," the doctor commanded quietly, his voice carrying a gravity that made the assembled company step away instinctively. After a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, he looked up with the grim expression of someone delivering unwelcome news. "I'm afraid Captain Weatherby is dead." Mrs. Blackwood let out a strangled cry, her grip tightening reflexively on the scarlet teapot she still held. The ornate piece seemed to gleam with malevolent purpose in the afternoon light, its crimson surface now appearing somehow sinister rather than beautiful. Colonel Melchett stepped forward with military authority, his face set in stern lines. "Nobody touch anything," he ordered sharply. "Mrs. Fortescue, telephone the police immediately. Inspector Slack must be informed at once." His weathered features betrayed years of experience with matters that required official attention. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair beneath the roses, her knitting forgotten as she approached with measured steps. Her keen blue eyes took in every detail of the tragic scene, the captain's contorted features, the way Dr. Pemberton continued to examine the body with professional thoroughness, and most particularly, the faint but distinctive scent that seemed to hang in the warm air. "Rather like bitter almonds, isn't it?" she murmured softly, more to herself than to anyone in particular. Dr. Pemberton glanced up sharply, his young face registering both surprise and recognition. "You noticed it too?" "Yes. It's quite the characteristic of certain substances that have no business at a garden party." The implications of this exchange were not lost on the more astute members of the gathering. Mrs. Gladys Fortescue, returning breathlessly from telephoning the police, clutched her sister's arm with white-knuckled intensity. "Inspector Slack is coming directly," she announced, her voice trembling with a mixture of shock and the peculiar excitement that accompanies proximity to scandal. Reverend Clement moved among his parishioners with quiet dignity, offering words of comfort while his wife Leonard began the practical task of shepherding the more distressed ladies toward the shade of the house. The social machinery of the village, so recently devoted to charitable tea and pleasant conversation, now reorganized itself around the stark reality of sudden death. Miss Marple's attention wandered to the small table near the arbor where Captain Weatherby had been standing earlier. Her sharp eyes caught sight of something that others had overlooked in their distress, a small, crumpled paper twist lying half-hidden among the clover, the kind used for wrapping sweets or powders. She made no move to retrieve it, but filed its location away in her methodical mind. Mrs. Blackwood finally found her voice, though it emerged as little, more than a whisper. "I don't understand how this could have happened. The tea was perfectly normal. I prepared it exactly as I always do, with the same leaves, the same method." Her eyes darted repeatedly to the scarlet teapot, as though it might somehow provide answers to the terrible questions now arising. Miss Prudence Hartwell stood apart from the main group, her artistic sensibilities clearly shaken by the transformation of the peaceful gathering into something far more sinister. "He had only taken 2 sips, she observed with the precision of someone accustomed to noting details. "Barely enough to taste." The sound of approaching motor cars announced the arrival of official authority, their engines cutting through the afternoon air like harbingers of the investigation that would inevitably follow. Miss Marple smoothed her skirts and settled back into quiet observation, knowing that in the hours ahead, the true nature of the people around her would emerge under the pressure of official scrutiny. The scarlet teapot sat gleaming in the center of the white linen cloth, now the focal point of what had become something far more serious than a village tragedy. Inspector Slack emerged from his motor car with the purposeful stride of a man accustomed to village emergencies, though his expression suggested this particular call warranted considerably more attention than the usual disputes over property boundaries or wandering livestock. His keen eyes swept across the transformed garden party scene, taking in the covered body on the pristine lawn, the cluster of shocked guests, and the general atmosphere of genteel horror that had settled over Meadowbank House like an unwelcome shroud. Doctor. Pemberton rose from beside Captain Weatherby's still form as the inspector approached, his young face grave with professional concern. Inspector Slack, I'm afraid this appears to be a case of poisoning. The symptoms were quite characteristic: rapid onset, respiratory distress, and a distinctive bitter almond odor that suggests cyanide or a similar compound. Miss Marple, observing from her position near the rose arbor, noted how the doctor's assessment confirmed her own quiet suspicions. She had encountered that particular scent before, during an unfortunate incident in Market Basing some years earlier, though she kept this observation to herself for the moment. Inspector Slack produced his notebook with practiced efficiency. Right then, I'll need statements from everyone present, and nobody leaves until I've spoken with them personally. His gaze settled on Mrs. Blackwood, who still clutched the scarlet teapot with white-knuckled intensity. You served the tea, I understand? Mrs. Blackwood nodded shakily. Yes, Inspector, from this very pot. It's my special family blend. Captain Weatherby always complimented it so graciously. Her voice carried a tremor that might have been grief or something more complex. Miss Marple's observant eyes caught a detail that others seemed to have missed. Mrs. Blackwood wore only one glove, the other having been hastily stuffed into her pocket with the fingertips still visible. Suede gloves, she reflected, had a particular tendency to retain whatever substances they encountered, and removing one in haste suggested something more than mere discomfort from the afternoon warmth. Inspector Slack began his methodical examination of the tea service, his trained eye noting the sugar bowl, the delicate tongs, and the various cups scattered about the table. Constable Morrison, photographs of everything. Then we'll need the teapot, all the cups, and anything else that might have come into contact with what the deceased consumed. As the constable began his work, Miss Prudence Hartwell stepped forward with the careful precision of someone choosing her words deliberately. Inspector, if I may observe, I've some experience with ceramics, and that particular teapot has some rather unusual characteristics for a piece supposedly dating to the 18th century. The glaze quality is remarkably vivid for something of that age. Mrs. Blackwood's face flushed with indignation. Miss Hartwell has been in our village barely 3 weeks, Inspector. I hardly think she's qualified to assess family heirlooms that have been treasured for generations. The exchange crackled with tension that went beyond mere disagreement about antiques, and Miss Marple filed this observation away with her characteristic thoroughness. In her extensive experience, she had learned that the smallest social frictions often revealed the deepest secrets when tragedy struck a close-knit community. Meanwhile, the assembled villagers had begun the familiar ritual of shock giving way to speculation. Mrs. Gladys Fortescue whispered urgently with her sister about who might possess such deadly substances, while Major Palgrave and Colonel Melchett engaged in hushed debate about the security implications of poison in their peaceful village. Miss Marple's attention wandered to the small paper twist she had noticed earlier, still lying half-concealed among the clover near where Captain Weatherby had stood. She made no move to point it out directly, but positioned herself where Inspector Slack might naturally discover it during his systematic examination of the scene. Inspector, she said quietly, I believe there may be something of interest near the arbor, where the captain was standing just before he approached the tea table. Slack followed her subtle indication. Using his pen, carefully lifted the crumpled paper into an evidence envelope. The faint residue clinging to its creases would require laboratory analysis, but even to the naked eye, it suggested something more sinister than the innocent remnants of a garden party. As the investigation machinery began its inexorable work, Miss Marple settled back into quiet observation, knowing that the truth behind Captain Weatherby's death would emerge not from forensic science alone, but from understanding the complex web of human relationships that bound this seemingly peaceful community together. Inspector Slack arranged the remaining guests on the terrace with the methodical efficiency of a man accustomed to transforming social gatherings into crime scenes. The wicker chairs, so recently occupied by people enjoying pleasant conversation over tea and cakes, now formed an impromptu interview area where each person would be called upon to account for their movements and observations. Mrs. Blackwood was summoned first, her composure somewhat restored, though Miss Marple noted the way her fingers worried at the seam of her remaining glove. Through the partially opened French doors, her testimony carried clearly to those waiting outside. "I prepared the tea, exactly as I always do, Inspector," she began, her voice carefully controlled. "The leaves are a special family blend, my late husband's grandmother's recipe. I brought the Scarlet Teapot from the pantry myself, brewed the tea on the spirit lamp right there on the table. Nothing was different from any other garden party we've held." Inspector Slack's pen scratched steadily across his notebook. "Who had access to the tea service while you were preparing it? Or during the serving?" "Well, everyone was moving about, naturally. It was a social gathering." Mrs. Blackwood's tone carried a slight defensive edge. Miss Hartwell was particularly interested in the teapot, asking rather pointed questions about its history and craftsmanship. She seemed quite intense about it. When Miss Hartwell was called for questioning, she moved with the careful dignity of someone aware that every gesture was being scrutinized. Her voice, when it emerged from the drawing room, held the measured precision of an expert discussing her field. "Inspector, I must be honest about my concerns regarding that teapot. My late aunt was a ceramics specialist, and I inherited both her collection and her knowledge. The piece Mrs. Blackwood claims is 18th century displays characteristics that are distinctly modern. The glaze composition, the brilliance of the red coloring, even the base markings suggest contemporary manufacture. The sharp intake of breath from the terrace was audible even inside." Mrs. Blackwood's voice rose with indignation when she was recalled. "This is outrageous. Miss Hartwell has been in our village barely 3 weeks, poking about, asking impertinent questions about everyone's belongings. She's clearly trying to deflect attention from herself. Who else would have access to such exotic substances as cyanide?" Miss Marple, observing from her position near the roses, noted several details that others seemed to overlook. The sugar tongs bore a faint smudge near their pivot point, not grime, but the suggestion of hasty handling. Mrs. Blackwood's ungloved hand showed slight redness around the knuckles, consistent with vigorous scrubbing. Most intriguingly, the small paper twist that Inspector Slack had secured contained traces that would tell their own story once analyzed. Dr. Pemberton provided clinical testimony when his turn came. The symptoms were unmistakable: acute cyanide poisoning. Death occurred within minutes of ingestion. The concentration must have been quite significant and specifically targeted to Captain Weatherby's cup, as no one else was affected. Major Palgrave, when questioned, offered military bluntness. "Weatherby was in fine spirits, Inspector. Complimented the tea particularly. Asked for a second cup, which he rarely did. Said something about the flavor being especially good today." Reverend Clement's testimony was characteristically thoughtful. Captain Weatherby seemed entirely himself, cheerful, engaging. He was discussing plans for the church roof fund with Mrs. Fortescue just before the incident occurred. As the interviews progressed, Miss Marple observed the subtle shifts in group dynamics. Mrs. Fortescue and her sister whispered urgently about outsiders bringing trouble to their peaceful village. Miss Hartwell sat rigidly apart, clearly aware that suspicion was crystallizing around her newcomer status and specialized knowledge. Yet something nagged at Miss Marple's methodical mind. The obvious suspect was often exactly that, in her experience, too obvious. The bitter almond scent had been unmistakable, the delivery method clear, but the human motivations remained murky. In street, Mary Mead, she had learned, the deepest secrets were often hidden beneath the most ordinary surfaces. Inspector Slack emerged from his preliminary interviews with the expression of a man who believed he had identified his primary suspect, but Miss Marple sensed that the true complexity of the case was only beginning to unfold. Inspector Slack's methodical examination of the crime scene began to yield results that seemed to confirm his initial suspicions about Miss Hartwell, yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by details that didn't quite align with the obvious narrative. As Constable Morrison conducted a thorough search of the tea service and surrounding areas, his discoveries painted a picture that was both illuminating and puzzling. The first significant breakthrough came when Morrison emerged from the pantry carrying a small evidence bag. "Inspector found this among the sugar cubes in the cut glass bowl," he announced, holding up a single lump that bore a tiny but unmistakable puncture mark. "Looks like someone used a fine needle or similar instrument." Mrs. Blackwood's face went pale as she stared at the evidence. "Anyone could have tampered with that bowl," she protested, her voice carrying a defensive edge that hadn't been present earlier. "People were moving about freely all afternoon. The pantry door was never locked." Miss Marple, observing from her position near the roses, noted several curious details that others seemed to overlook. Mrs. Fortescue approached with the eager expression of someone bearing important information. "Inspector, I do hope this isn't speaking out of turn, but there was a registered parcel delivered to Meadowbank House on Wednesday. From London. My clerk couldn't help but notice the label Bitter Almond Essence, Special Order." The revelation sent a ripple of tension through the assembled group. Mrs. Blackwood's remaining glove twisted in her hands as she responded with careful precision. "It was for baking, Inspector. I had planned to make macaroons for today's gathering, though I ultimately decided against it." Yet no macaroons appeared, Mrs. Fortescue's sister couldn't resist adding, earning a sharp look from Inspector Slack. Dr. Pemberton, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, stepped forward with the measured tone of someone offering professional insight. "Inspector, there's something about the timing that troubles me medically. Cyanide typically acts within seconds of ingestion, yet Captain Weatherby managed to set his cup properly on its saucer before collapsing. That suggests either an unusually delayed reaction, which is highly unlikely, or the poison wasn't in the tea itself." Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the significance of this observation immediately. "How very astute, Doctor. Captain Weatherby was always so particular about his manners. Even in distress, he wouldn't simply drop his cup. Yet if the poison wasn't in the tea—" Her gaze drifted to the sugar tongs, which still bore that curious smudge she had noticed earlier. The positioning was precise, exactly where fingers would grip the implement during use. More intriguingly, she recalled Mrs. Fortescue's earlier comment about Captain Weatherby's habits. "Mrs. Fortescue," Miss Marple said gently, "you mentioned that Captain Weatherby rarely took sugar in his tea. Was that your observation as well today?" "Oh, yes. That's what made it so remarkable. Mrs. Blackwood specifically recommended it, said. This particular blend required sweetening to bring out its full flavor." The captain laughed and agreed, though it was quite unlike him. Mrs. Blackwood's composure cracked slightly. "Many fine teas benefit from proper preparation," she said quickly. "I was simply ensuring my guests enjoyed the experience." Miss Prudence Hartwell, who had remained silent during these revelations, finally spoke with the careful precision of someone choosing her words deliberately. "Inspector, I feel I must mention something about that teapot. My professional examination suggests it's not the 18th century piece Mrs. Blackwood claims. The glaze characteristics and base markings indicate contemporary manufacture, a very skillful reproduction, but modern nonetheless." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Mrs. Blackwood's face flushed with indignation. "Miss Hartwell has been in our village barely 3 weeks. Making inquiries about everyone's possessions. I hardly think she's qualified to assess family heirlooms that have been treasured for generations." Inspector Slack made careful notes of each revelation, his expression suggesting growing confidence in his case. Yet Miss Marple found herself pondering the deeper implications. If the teapot was indeed a modern fake, Mrs. Blackwood's fierce protectiveness suggested motives that went far beyond family sentiment. More puzzling still was the question of how the poison had been administered to Captain Weatherby alone when multiple people had been served from the same pot. As Morrison continued gathering evidence, including a damp cloth from the scullery that bore faint traces of the telltale almond scent, Miss Marple reflected on the curious pattern emerging. The obvious suspect possessed specialized knowledge and opportunity, yet the victim's behavior suggested a more complex scheme than simple poisoning of the tea supply. The afternoon shadows were lengthening across Meadowbank House's pristine lawn, and with them came the growing certainty that this tragedy held secrets far more intricate than anyone yet suspected. The afternoon light had begun to fade when Constable Morrison emerged from the house, carrying a small bundle of correspondence that would transform the entire complexion of the investigation. "Inspector," he called, approaching with the measured urgency of someone bearing significant news. "Found this in the Morning Post basket, seems to have been mislaid earlier." Inspector Slack examined the cream-colored envelope with its distinctive London postmark and precise handwriting. The address read clearly, Captain Arthur Weatherby, Meadowbank Lodge, but had been redirected in violet ink with the notation, "To be delivered with urgency. A. B." The redirection appeared recent, the ink still bearing the faint sheen of hasty application. "Mrs. Blackwood," Slack called sharply. "This redirection your handwriting?" Mrs. Blackwood's remaining glove twisted in her hands as she examined the envelope. "The captain asked me to redirect any correspondence while he was staying at the lodge. Perfectly normal arrangement." Her voice carried a defensive edge that hadn't been present in her earlier testimony. Slack slit the envelope with methodical precision and withdrew a single sheet of heavy business stationery. As he read silently, his expression grew increasingly grave before he cleared his throat to address the assembled group. "From H.C. Bruton, ceramics specialist, Mayfair," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the garden. "Further to your inquiry regarding the Scarlet Chinese teapot, alleged to be 18th century, my preliminary assessment from the photograph you provided indicates the piece is a 20th century reproduction employing modern glazing techniques. The brilliant red coloration is consistent with contemporary Berlin formulations rather than period work. I would be happy to provide detailed authentication upon examination." The silence that followed was profound and telling. Mrs. Blackwood's face had gone pale, her hand moving instinctively to her throat in a gesture that mirrored Captain Weatherby's final moments. Miss Marple observed this reaction with the keen attention of someone who understood that truth often revealed itself in unconscious gestures. "Mrs." Leonard Clement approached Miss Marple with the quiet urgency of someone who had been wrestling with troubling observations. "Jane, there's something I must share." Just before the captain collapsed, I noticed Mrs. Blackwood watching him with the most peculiar expression, not the usual hostess concern, but something approaching anticipation, as though she were waiting for a specific moment. This revelation aligned perfectly with Miss Marple's growing understanding of the afternoon's events. She had been particularly struck by Mrs. Blackwood's insistence that Captain Weatherby take sugar, despite his well-known preference for unsweetened tea. The timing now seemed far from coincidental. Dr. Pemberton, who had been examining the sugar tongs more carefully, approached with professional concern. "Inspector, these chemical traces on the silver are quite distinctive. The discoloration suggests contact with an acidic compound, precisely what one would expect from cyanide salts. The positioning indicates deliberate handling rather than accidental contact." Miss Hartwell stepped forward with the measured precision of an expert offering testimony. "The authentication of ceramics often reveals more than artistic fraud, Inspector. When valuable pieces prove false, one must consider the financial implications, insurance claims, estate valuations." Loan collateral. The ramifications extend far beyond mere embarrassment. Mrs. Blackwood's composure finally cracked under the mounting evidence. Captain Weatherby had no right to pry into private family matters, she said, her voice rising with indignation. That teapot has been treasured in my family for generations. His suspicious nature and meddling questions were completely inappropriate for a guest in my home. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she processed these revelations. The pattern was becoming clearer. A desperate attempt to preserve a deception that had likely provided financial security through fraudulent means. Captain Weatherby's military precision and attention to detail had made him a dangerous threat to carefully constructed lies. Inspector Slack folded the letter with deliberate care. Mrs. Blackwood, I'll need a complete accounting of your financial arrangements involving that teapot, insurance policies, appraisals, any loans or sales negotiations. As the investigation shifted toward this new evidence, Miss Marple reflected on the curious human tendency to destroy what threatened exposure. The Scarlet Teapot had indeed been the centerpiece of the afternoon's tragedy, though not in the way anyone had initially suspected. The truth was emerging like a photograph developing in chemical solution, slowly, inevitably, and with devastating clarity. The financial records that Mrs. Blackwood reluctantly produced painted a picture of mounting desperation that explained much about the afternoon's tragedy, yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by details that suggested the true complexity of the case had only begun to emerge. Inspector Slack spread the documents across the mahogany desk in Mrs. Blackwood's study, his expression growing grimmer with each revelation. 3 separate insurance policies on that teapot, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of professional disapproval, valued at progressively higher amounts over the past 18 months. The most recent appraisal conducted just 6 weeks ago placed its worth at nearly £2,000. Mrs. Blackwood's remaining composure cracked visibly. My late husband left substantial debts, Inspector. The teapot was our family's only asset of real value. I simply wanted to ensure it was properly protected. Miss Marple, observing from her position near the French doors, noted the careful phrasing of this explanation. Mrs. Blackwood spoke of protection rather than authentication, a subtle distinction that suggested awareness of the deception's fragility. Dr. Pemberton approached with medical observations that would prove crucial to understanding the afternoon's events. Inspector, I've been reconsidering the poison delivery method. The rapid onset suggests direct contact with mucous membranes rather than simple ingestion. Captain Weatherby's habit of touching his mustache while thinking I observed it several times today could have provided the necessary exposure if his fingers had contacted a concentrated solution. This revelation cast the sugar tongs in an entirely new light. Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Blackwood's insistence that Captain Weatherby take sugar, despite his well-known preferences. More significantly, she remembered the particular way Mrs. Blackwood had handled the silver implements with her gloved hands, positioning them precisely for the captain's use. Mrs. Fortescue approached with information that added another layer to the developing picture. Inspector, I feel I must mention something about Captain Weatherby's recent activities. He'd been asking rather pointed questions about various villagers' circumstances who had unexpected windfalls, whose antiques seemed remarkably well preserved. That sort of thing. My sister thought he was simply making conversation. But now, the implication hung in the air like an accusation. Captain Weatherby hadn't been a casual observer but an active investigator, his military training applied to civilian mysteries with characteristic thoroughness. Miss Hartwell stepped forward with professional insight that illuminated the broader context. My aunt's correspondence included warnings about a sophisticated fraud network operating through rural auction houses and estate sales. Reproduction pieces were being systematically placed with unknowing inheritors, then authenticated through compromised appraisers. The profits were substantial enough to support entire criminal enterprises. Mrs. Blackwood's face went ashen at these words, her hand moving instinctively to her throat in a gesture that mirrored Captain Weatherby's final moments. "Miss Hartwell has been in our village barely 3 weeks," she protested weakly. "Her theories about criminal networks are pure fantasy." Yet Inspector Slack's examination of the financial records revealed patterns that supported Miss Hartwell's assessment. Regular payments to unfamiliar London addresses, correspondence with auction houses in distant counties, and most tellingly, a series of bank deposits that coincided precisely with insurance claim settlements. Miss Marple's attention wandered to the small details that others overlooked: the faint chemical odor that still clung to Mrs. Blackwood's clothing, despite her obvious attempts at cleaning, the way her ungloved hand showed slight discoloration around the fingertips, and most significantly, the careful positioning of items on the tea table that had ensured Captain Weatherby would handle specific implements. The sugar tongs were positioned quite deliberately. Miss Marple observed quietly. Someone with knowledge of the captain's habits would know exactly how he would grasp them, which fingers would make contact with the silver surface. Dr. Pemberton nodded grimly. "Cyanide compounds can be absorbed through skin contact, particularly if concentrated and applied to metal surfaces that enhance absorption. The symptoms would manifest within minutes of exposure." As the investigation machinery continued its methodical work, Miss Marple reflected on the human capacity for desperate measures when financial ruin threatened carefully constructed respectability. The Scarlet Teapot had indeed been the centerpiece of the afternoon's tragedy, though its role extended far beyond simple fraud into the darker territory of premeditated murder. The mounting evidence against Mrs. Blackwood had created an atmosphere of inexorable pressure in the study, yet Miss Marple sensed that the moment had arrived for a more direct approach to understanding the human heart behind the afternoon's tragedy. She requested a private word with Mrs. Blackwood, expressing her profound sympathy for the dreadful ordeal, and the exhausted woman agreed with weary resignation, perhaps seeing in Miss Marple's gentle demeanor a respite from Inspector Slack's methodical interrogation. "My dear Mrs. Blackwood," Miss Marple began, settling into a chair with her knitting, her voice carrying the soft warmth of genuine compassion. "What a shocking disruption to such a carefully planned gathering. You must have worked so hard to make everything perfect for your guests." She paused, her keen blue eyes noting the faint discoloration still visible around Mrs. Blackwood's knuckles despite obvious scrubbing. "It's remarkable how one tries to maintain appearances when one's world seems to be crumbling." Mrs. Blackwood's remaining composure wavered at these gentle words. "One does what one must, Miss Marple. For the sake of propriety, for my dear husband's memory, one cannot simply surrender to circumstances." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she continued her observation. Captain Weatherby was such a thorough gentleman, wasn't he? Always noticing the smallest details, asking such precise questions. Rather like my nephew Raymond, when he's working on one of his scholarly articles, absolutely relentless in pursuing accuracy. Her tone remained conversational, yet beneath it lay an understanding that made Mrs. Blackwood shift uncomfortably. Such attention to detail can be quite unsettling when one has delicate matters to protect. The words struck their target with surgical precision. Mrs. Blackwood's breath caught slightly as she responded with forced calm. "Captain Weatherby could be rather intrusive, I'm afraid. Always poking about, questioning things that were frankly none of his concern." Miss Marple nodded with apparent sympathy, while her observant eyes took in every nuance of expression and gesture. How trying that must have been, especially with the teapot being such a treasured family piece. The insurance arrangements alone must have required considerable creativity to properly protect its value. Dr. Pemberton, who had been quietly examining the sugar tongs with professional interest, approached with additional observations. "Miss Marple, the contamination pattern on these implements is quite telling. The cyanide solution was applied with remarkable precision exactly where fingers would naturally grip the silver, Someone with detailed knowledge of the captain's habits would have known precisely how he held his utensils. Mrs. Blackwood's face went pale at this clinical assessment. Miss Marple continued her gentle but relentless inquiry. "Such a distinctive scent. Bitter almonds. It has a way of lingering, doesn't it? Rather like the memory of unpleasant necessities." Her gaze flickered meaningfully to Mrs. Blackwood's scrubbed hands. Captain Weatherby's correspondence from London must have been quite alarming, discovering that one's most precious possession might not be exactly what one had believed. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. Mrs. Blackwood's carefully maintained facade began to crack as she whispered, "He wouldn't listen to reason, threatened to bring in independent appraisers, to expose everything publicly. My husband's debts, the insurance claims, he would have destroyed what little security I had left." Inspector Slack stepped forward with renewed interest, but Miss Marple raised a gentle hand, sensing that complete revelation required more delicate handling. "Of course, my dear. When one is desperate, when everything one has worked to preserve is threatened, the mind can conceive of solutions that might otherwise seem unthinkable." Yet, even as Mrs. Blackwood seemed on the verge of complete confession, Miss Marple noticed something that troubled her methodical mind. The precision required for the poisoning, the careful timing of the captain's encouragement to use sugar, the sophisticated knowledge of chemical application, all suggested either remarkable presence of mind under pressure or assistance from someone with specialized expertise. Her eyes drifted to the window where Miss Hartwell could be seen in the garden, ostensibly examining the roses, but positioned where she could observe the study's occupants. 3 weeks in the village, specialized knowledge of ceramic fraud, immediate focus on the teapot's authenticity, the pattern suggested motivations that extended beyond casual newcomer curiosity. Mrs. Blackwood followed Miss Marple's gaze, and something flickered in her expression, not just guilt, but a complexity that suggested the afternoon's tragedy held layers that had not yet been fully explored. The Scarlet Teapot might have been the catalyst, but the human relationships surrounding its deadly secret were proving more intricate than anyone had initially suspected. Miss Marple resumed her knitting with thoughtful precision, knowing that while truth was emerging, the complete picture remained tantalizingly out of focus. Miss Marple's observation of the subtle interplay between Mrs. Blackwood's guilt and fear prompted her to step quietly into the garden, where Miss Hartwell continued her careful examination of the roses with movements that suggested monitoring rather than mere botanical appreciation. The positioning afforded a clear view of the study windows, and her behavior carried the purposeful quality of someone conducting surveillance rather than casual observation. "Such beautiful roses," Miss Marple observed gently as she approached, her knitting tucked under her arm with characteristic composure. "You seem to have developed quite an appreciation for their cultivation in your short time here. My nephew Raymond always says that understanding gardens requires the same attention to detail as understanding people." Miss Hartwell startled slightly at the interruption, though she recovered with professional smoothness. "Indeed, Miss Marple. Careful observation reveals much about both plants and their tenders. Mrs. Blackwood clearly takes great pride in maintaining appearances, though one wonders about the foundation beneath such careful cultivation." The phrase carried implications that extended far beyond horticulture, and Miss Marple filed this observation away with methodical precision. Their conversation was interrupted by Inspector Slack's approach, his expression bearing the weight of significant discoveries that would transform the entire complexion of the investigation. "Ladies, I must ask you to return to the terrace," he announced with official authority. "We've uncovered correspondence that sheds considerable new light on recent events." Inspector Slack had arranged a collection of letters on the garden table, their official letterheads clearly visible to the assembled group. "These were found in Captain Weatherby's room at the lodge," he declared, his voice carrying the gravity of major revelation. "Correspondence with Scotland Yard's Art Fraud Division, requesting assistance with an investigation into sophisticated ceramic forgeries operating through rural estate sales." The announcement sent ripples of shock through the remaining guests. Mrs. Blackwood's face went ashen as the implications registered, while Miss Hartwell's carefully maintained composure showed its first signs of genuine distress. Captain Weatherby's systematic questioning, his attention to detail, his methodical approach to gathering information all now made perfect sense within the context of official investigation rather than mere social curiosity. Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she processed this revelation alongside her growing understanding of the afternoon's events. How fascinating that Captain Weatherby possessed such specialized knowledge, she observed with deceptive mildness. The sophistication required for this particular crime, the precise application of poison, the understanding of absorption rates, the timing necessary to affect only the intended victim suggests either remarkable expertise or careful instruction from someone with professional training. Miss Hartwell's face had grown increasingly pale during the assessment, her professional composure finally showing cracks under the mounting implications. "The world of high-end art fraud is indeed complex, Miss Marple," she responded with careful modulation, though her voice carried a new brittleness. "Such schemes require not merely artistic skill, but keen understanding of human psychology, and sometimes even chemistry, to ensure desired outcomes." Miss Marple nodded with apparent sympathy, while her observant mind catalogued every nuance of expression and gesture. "Chemistry, yes. Bitter almonds, as Dr. Pemberton mentioned, such a distinctive scent, requiring very careful handling. One would need precise knowledge of application methods and dosage to ensure effectiveness without accidental self-harm. Rather specialized expertise, wouldn't you agree?" The gentle but relentless probing was having its intended effect. Miss Hartwell's hands, previously so steady in their examination of the roses, now trembled almost imperceptibly as she responded. "Expertise can indeed be a double-edged sword, Miss Marple. It can create magnificent works of art, or it can be employed for more observations that added crucial pieces to the developing picture." The contamination pattern on the sugar tongs required remarkably precise knowledge of chemical behavior and human physiology. This wasn't amateur poisoning, but the work of someone with genuine scientific understanding. Miss Hartwell's carefully constructed facade was beginning to fracture under the accumulated pressure of evidence and implication. Her eyes, which had maintained such cool, analytical distance throughout the afternoon, now held something approaching resignation mixed with defiance. Miss Marple continued her gentle but inexorable questioning, sensing that the moment for complete revelation was rapidly approaching, though she remained acutely aware that the full complexity of the conspiracy had not yet been entirely exposed. The mounting evidence had created an atmosphere of inexorable tension on the terrace, yet Miss Marple sensed that the moment had arrived for her characteristic blend of gentle experimentation and psychological insight to illuminate the complete truth behind Captain Weatherby's death. She approached Inspector Slack with the unassuming confidence of someone who had spent decades observing human nature in all its fascinating complexity. "Inspector," she began with deceptive mildness, "I wonder if we might conduct a small demonstration. It would comfort me greatly to observe precisely how the tea service was handled this afternoon." Her pale blue eyes held the particular brightness that those familiar with her methods had learned to recognize as significant. Inspector Slack, remembering previous occasions when Miss Marple's seemingly innocent experiments had proved decisive, nodded his agreement. Fresh implements were arranged on a garden table, clean sugar tongs, an empty bowl, proper spacing that replicated the original tea service arrangement. "Would each of you be so kind as to demonstrate how you handled the sugar tongs this afternoon?" Miss Marple requested, with gentle authority. The demonstration proved illuminating in ways that transcended mere recreation. Major Palgrave approached with characteristic military directness, grasping the implements with efficient practicality. Mrs. Fortescue handled them with the delicate precision of someone accustomed to fine china, while Dr. Pemberton's grip reflected medical training in precise instrument handling. Miss Hartwell's approach, however, revealed the controlled movements of someone with specialized knowledge. her fingers positioned with the exactitude of a craftsperson, familiar with delicate tools and potentially dangerous substances. Most significantly, when Mrs. Blackwood's turn arrived, her unconscious muscle memory betrayed her completely. Without thinking, she positioned the tongs at precisely the angle Miss Marple remembered from the fatal tea service, her fingers closing naturally on the exact spots where the faint chemical residue had been detected. "Thank you all," Miss Marple said quietly, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm as she processed these revelations alongside her growing understanding of the afternoon's events. Miss Hartwell's composure showed its first genuine cracks as she observed the demonstration's implications. "The application of specialized knowledge," she said with careful modulation, though her voice carried new brittleness, "often extends beyond its original artistic purpose. My aunt's expertise in ceramic chemistry included understanding the properties of various compounds in their raw states, including those used in glazes and pigments that can be quite dangerous before proper firing and stabilization." Miss Marple nodded with apparent sympathy, while her observant mind catalogued every nuance. How fascinating that ceramic artistry requires such intimate knowledge of toxic substances. Cyanide compounds, for instance, play crucial roles in certain glazing processes, particularly in achieving those brilliant red colorations we observed in the Scarlet Teapot. Dr. Pemberton stepped forward with professional interest. The contamination pattern on the sugar tongs required remarkably precise knowledge of chemical behavior and absorption rates. Someone with genuine scientific understanding would know exactly how to apply a concentrated solution for maximum effectiveness while avoiding accidental self-exposure. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. Mrs. Blackwood's remaining composure cracked as she whispered desperately, "She told me it was necessary. Said Captain Weatherby was dangerous, that he would destroy everything I had worked to preserve. She provided the solution, showed me exactly how to apply it safely, claimed it would look like an unfortunate accident." Miss Hartwell's carefully maintained facade finally fractured under this partial revelation. "Mrs. Blackwood faced complete financial ruin," she said, her voice carrying defensive authority. "Captain Weatherby's investigation threatened not just her security, but an entire network of arrangements that had provided assistance to women facing desperate circumstances." Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered this justification with characteristic thoroughness. "A network, you say? How very interesting that such arrangements would require the elimination of a Scotland Yard investigator rather than honest cooperation with legitimate authorities." The Scarlet Teapot sat gleaming in the evening light, its false beauty now revealed as the centerpiece of a conspiracy that had claimed an innocent life in service of maintaining profitable deceptions that extended far beyond simple insurance fraud into something approaching organized criminal enterprise. The evening shadows lengthened across Meadowbank House's pristine lawn as Miss Marple set down her knitting with the quiet finality of someone who had reached an inevitable conclusion. The scent of roses mingled with the cooling air, creating an atmosphere of deceptive tranquility that belied the deadly truth about to be revealed. Her pale blue eyes held the particular brightness that those familiar with her methods had learned to recognize as the precursor to complete understanding. "Miss Hartwell," she began with characteristic gentleness, though her voice carried an authority that made the assembled company lean forward with unconscious attention. "Your arrival in Street Mary Mead 3 weeks ago was remarkably well timed, wasn't it? Just as Captain Weatherby was intensifying his investigation into ceramic fraud networks operating through rural communities." Miss Hartwell's carefully maintained composure showed its first genuine cracks under this direct observation. Her hands, previously so steady in their examination of the roses, now trembled almost imperceptibly as she responded with forced calm. "Coincidences occur, Miss Marple. One cannot control the timing of inheritance or the need to settle family estates." Miss Marple nodded with apparent sympathy, while her observant mind catalogued every nuance of expression and defensive gesture. "Indeed, though some coincidences prove less coincidental than they initially appear. The method employed this afternoon required not desperation alone, but precise scientific knowledge combined with intimate understanding of human psychology. Mrs. Blackwood possessed the former in abundance, but you, my dear, provided the latter with calculating precision. She gestured delicately toward the evidence table, where the sugar tongs lay gleaming in the fading light. The poison was never in the tea itself, as Dr. Pemberton so astutely observed. Captain Weatherby's habit of touching his moustache while considering remarks made him particularly vulnerable to contact poisoning. A concentrated cyanide solution, painted along the exact ridges of the sugar tongs where his fingers would naturally grip, would be absorbed through the skin within moments of handling. Dr. Pemberton stepped forward with professional confirmation. The absorption rate through skin contact explains the delayed onset, just enough time for the captain to set down his cup with characteristic politeness before the poison reached fatal concentration in his system. Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she continued her systematic exposition. Your expertise in ceramic chemistry, Miss Hartwell, provided not merely artistic knowledge, but intimate familiarity with the toxic compounds used in glazes and pigments. Cyanide salts, essential for achieving certain brilliant colorations like that scarlet glaze, would be readily available to someone of your professional background. Miss Hartwell's defiance flared with desperate intensity. Captain Weatherby was destroying lives with his relentless investigation. Mrs. Blackwood faced complete financial ruin, social disgrace, homelessness. His interference threatened carefully constructed arrangements that had provided assistance to dozens of women facing similar desperation. Arrangements, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, her tone suggesting deeper understanding than the euphemism intended to convey. You describe a sophisticated criminal network, don't you? Vulnerable women, recently widowed and financially desperate, were provided with reproduction pieces to substitute for valuable family heirlooms. Insurance claims were filed, auction sales arranged, everyone benefiting from these charitable arrangements. Mrs. Blackwood's face showed a mixture of dawning comprehension and horror as the full scope of her manipulation became clear. She told me it was helping people, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the evening breeze. Women like myself, left with debts and no resources. She said the teapot substitution would protect its value while ensuring my financial security. Miss Marple's expression carried profound sadness as she observed the human cost of such calculated exploitation. Yet the method chosen for eliminating Captain Weatherby reveals the true nature of this assistance. Miss Hartwell encouraged you to apply the poison yourself, while she remained safely distant, making you the instrument of murder while keeping her own hands entirely clean. The psychological accuracy of this observation struck home with devastating effect. Mrs. Blackwood stared at Miss Hartwell with the horrified recognition of someone who had been thoroughly used. You made me believe I was protecting myself, but you were protecting your entire criminal enterprise. Inspector Slack, who had been making careful notes throughout these revelations, stepped forward with renewed authority. The bitter almond essence ordered for baking provided perfect cover for the poison's presence, while Mrs. Blackwood's single glove, the right one, I believe allowed repeated washing of the left hand without arousing suspicion about lingering chemical odors. Miss Marple nodded approvingly at this deduction. Quite correct, Inspector. The punctured sugar cube was merely a decoy, placed too obviously among the others to serve any real purpose except misdirection. The true delivery method required the precision that only specialized knowledge could provide. Miss Hartwell's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled completely under the accumulated weight of evidence and psychological pressure. Captain Weatherby was a dangerous amateur, playing with forces beyond his comprehension, she said, her voice carrying bitter defensiveness mixed with chilling conviction. His clumsy investigation threatened to destroy years of careful work, ruined by one meddling man who couldn't understand the greater good being served. The admission revealed the cold calculation behind the afternoon's tragedy. Miss Marple observed this final revelation with the sorrowful understanding of someone who had witnessed the darker aspects of human nature throughout her long experience with village mysteries. Inspector Slack stepped forward with official authority, his notebook ready to record the formal charges. Miss Hartwell, I'm arresting you for conspiracy to commit murder and multiple counts of fraud. Mrs. Blackwood, you'll need to accompany me for questioning regarding your role in Captain Weatherby's death. As the constables led the two women away, one defiant, the other broken by the realization of her manipulation, Miss Marple gathered her knitting with characteristic composure. The Scarlet Teapot sat abandoned on the evidence table, its brilliant red surface no longer beautiful but merely the remnant of a deadly deception that had claimed an innocent life. The remaining guests dispersed with the subdued manner of people who had witnessed the exposure of secrets that would forever change their understanding of their peaceful village. Mrs. Fortescue whispered urgently with her sister about the shocking revelations, while Dr. Pemberton shook his head at the sophisticated cruelty that had masqueraded as charitable assistance to vulnerable women. Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony that the Scarlet Teapot, with its false beauty and fraudulent provenance, had indeed been the centerpiece of the afternoon's tragedy. Yet the human cost extended far beyond simple financial deception into the darker territory of exploitation and premeditated murder. Where desperation had been weaponized by calculated evil, the afternoon sun was setting over Meadowbank House's pristine lawn, casting long shadows that seemed to echo the darkness that had briefly touched their tranquil community. In her extensive experience, Miss Marple had learned that the most dangerous criminals were often those who justified their actions through claims of helping others, using compassion itself as a tool for manipulation and control. The garden party was over, but its lessons about human nature would linger long after the last guest had departed and the evidence had been cleared away. The motor cars, carrying Miss Hartwell and Mrs. Blackwood, disappeared into the gathering dusk, their headlights cutting through the evening mist as they bore away the architects of the afternoon's tragedy. Miss Marple remained on the terrace of Meadowbank House, her knitting forgotten in her lap as she observed the profound transformation that had settled over the peaceful gathering like a shroud. The remaining guests moved with the subdued manner of people who had witnessed something that would forever alter their understanding of their tranquil community. Inspector Slack's systematic examination of Ivy Cottage yielded discoveries that painted a chilling picture of the criminal network's true scope. Among Miss Hartwell's ceramic supplies and artistic materials, Constable Morrison uncovered a leather-bound ledger containing what could only be described as a catalogue of exploitation. Neat columns recorded placements with discrete initials, dates, and sums that corresponded with devastating precision to insurance claims and auction proceeds across multiple counties. Dr. Pemberton approached Miss Marple with the thoughtful expression of someone processing the clinical aspects of what they had witnessed. The sophistication of the method troubles me greatly, Miss Marple. The precise knowledge required, the understanding of absorption rates, the timing necessary to affect only the intended victim. It suggests this wasn't Miss Hartwell's first venture into such deadly territory. Miss Marple nodded gravely, her pale blue eyes reflecting the weight of this observation. Indeed, Doctor. In my experience, such expertise develops through practice rather than theoretical knowledge alone. I suspect Inspector Slack's investigation will uncover additional cases where Captain Weatherby's counterparts in other communities met similarly convenient ends when they threatened these profitable arrangements. The most damning piece of evidence emerged from Miss Hartwell's desk, an unposted letter addressed to a widow in Bath, its contents a chilling blend of sympathy and calculated opportunity. The correspondence offered assurances about stabilizing the family peace and arranging valuation discreetly, written in the calm, managerial voice of someone who considered herself a facilitator rather than a predator. There was no melodrama in the language, no gloating, only the business-like tone that made Miss Hartwell's methods particularly insidious. Mrs. Fortescue approached with information that had seemed insignificant during the afternoon's social pleasantries, but now carried sinister implications. Miss Marple, I feel I must mention that Miss Hartwell made several inquiries at the post office about which villagers received regular correspondence from London. She was particularly interested in anyone dealing with insurance companies or auction houses. This revelation illuminated Miss Hartwell's systematic approach to identifying potential victims, not random opportunism, but methodical targeting of women whose circumstances made them vulnerable to sophisticated manipulation disguised as charitable assistance. In the quiet drawing room where she awaited transport to the police station, Mrs. Blackwood spoke in the flattened voice of someone who had relinquished both defiance and pride. "I thought it would be a stain I could wash away," she said, staring at her hands with hollow-eyed recognition of her manipulation. "Prudence showed me exactly how to hold the tongs, where to touch and where not to. She told me I was merely preventing a humiliation that would ruin me forever. That Captain Weatherby's interference would destroy not just me, but dozens of other women who had found security through these arrangements." Miss Marple listened with the patient compassion of someone who understood that confession must find its own natural course. "One imagines the worst as a single, catastrophic event," she observed, gently. "Yet, it is more often a series of small compliances. We surrender one scruple, then another, until we have given away the very thing we meant to protect." Reverend Clement moved among the remaining guests with pastoral concern, his face bearing the strain of witnessing evil masquerading as charity. The exploitation of vulnerable women, using their desperation as a weapon against them, it's a particularly cruel form of manipulation. Blackwood genuinely believed she was protecting herself while being guided toward murder. Colonel Melchett, who had remained largely silent during the dramatic revelations, stepped forward with military directness. "Miss Marple, your methods this afternoon were exemplary. The psychological pressure you applied revealed truths that conventional interrogation might never have uncovered. Captain Weatherby would have appreciated such thorough detective work." The tribute carried particular poignancy given the circumstances of the captain's death. His military training and attention to detail had made him a dangerous threat to the very network he was investigating, while his gentlemanly habits had been transformed into weapons against him by someone who studied people with the same precision she applied to ceramic glazes. As the evidence was carefully secured, the Scarlet Teapot underwent its final transformation from treasured heirloom to criminal exhibit. Its brilliant crimson surface, once a symbol of Mrs. Blackwood's supposed heritage and social standing, now seemed to possess a malevolent quality, a silent testament to the deadly charade it had enabled. The piece would become crucial evidence in what promised to be a complex prosecution involving multiple jurisdictions and numerous victims of the fraudulent network. Miss Marple gathered her knitting with thoughtful precision as the evening shadows lengthened across the village. The roses in Mrs. Blackwood's carefully tended garden still bloomed with their usual beauty. Yet their fragrance seemed to carry a faint, almost imperceptible undertone that reminded her of bitter almonds, a ghostly echo of the afternoon's tragedy that would linger long after the physical evidence had been removed. As Dr. Pemberton offered to escort her home through the gathering twilight, Miss Marple reflected on the afternoon's sobering lessons about human nature. "The most successful criminals, Doctor, understand that people will justify almost any action if it's presented as protecting what they hold dear." Miss Hartwell exploited that fundamental weakness with remarkable precision, transforming compassion itself into an instrument of control and exploitation. She paused at her garden gate, her hand resting on the familiar wooden latch as she considered the deeper implications of what they had witnessed. "What troubles me most is not the fraud itself, but the corruption of Mrs. Blackwood's character, lured by promises of security into becoming first an unwitting accomplice, then a desperate murderer. Her pride in that teapot, a symbol of her precarious social standing, blinded her to the true nature of the assistance she was receiving." Mary Mead settled into its evening routine, though the events at Meadowbank House had left an indelible mark on its peaceful facade. The familiar rhythms would continue, Mrs. Fortescue would sort the Morning Post, Reverend Clement would prepare his Sunday sermon, Dr. Pemberton would make his rounds, but all would carry the knowledge that evil could flourish even in the most tranquil settings when it wore the mask of charitable assistance and claimed to serve the greater good. Miss Marple entered her cottage with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had once again witnessed justice prevail over deception, though the human cost of such victories never failed to touch her compassionate heart. In her sitting room, she set aside her knitting and put the kettle on a plain brown pot that had poured honest tea for many years, and reflected that in a world of scarlet deceits and brilliant facades, simple honesty and clear observation remained the surest defenses against those who would exploit human weakness for profit and power. The Scarlet Teapot Mystery was solved, but its lessons about the depths to which desperation could drive decent people, and the calculating cruelty of those who would exploit such desperation, would remain with her always, another thread woven into her vast understanding of human nature in all its tragic complexity. 3 weeks had passed since the tragedy at Meadowbank House and Street. Mary Mead had begun to settle into its familiar rhythms. Though the events surrounding the Scarlet Teapot had left subtle but permanent changes in the village's social fabric, Miss Marple sat in her garden on a crisp autumn morning, her knitting needles moving with practiced precision as she reflected on the complex web of human motivations that had culminated in Captain Weatherby's death. The Morning Post brought news from Inspector Slack that confirmed her darkest suspicions about the scope of Miss Hartwell's criminal enterprise. The investigation had uncovered 17 similar cases across 4 counties, each involving recently widowed women who had been approached with offers of assistance in protecting valuable family heirlooms through strategic substitution and insurance arrangements. In 3 instances, men who had grown suspicious of the transactions had died under circumstances that, in retrospect, suggested systematic elimination rather than coincidental misfortune. Dr. Pemberton stopped by during his morning rounds, his young face bearing the thoughtful expression of someone still processing the clinical precision of the murder method they had witnessed. The laboratory analysis confirmed traces of pure cyanide crystals in that paper twist you spotted, he reported, settling into the garden chair beside her. Miss Hartwell's ceramic supplies included compounds that could easily be refined into lethal concentrations. Her expertise wasn't merely artistic, it was genuinely scientific. Miss Marple nodded with grave understanding. The most dangerous criminals, Doctor, are those who possess both technical expertise and the psychological insight to manipulate others into serving their purposes. Miss Hartwell transformed Mrs. Blackwood's desperation into a weapon while keeping her own hands entirely clean until direct action became necessary. The village had rallied around Mrs. Blackwood's children with characteristic compassion, though the social dynamics had shifted in ways that would take years to fully resolve. Reverend Clement had spoken eloquently from his pulpit about the dangers of pride and the insidious nature of exploitation, his words carrying particular weight for a congregation that had witnessed the transformation of a respected neighbor into a desperate murderer. Mrs. Fortescue approached through the garden gate with purposeful stride. Miss Marple, there's been a development regarding Ivy Cottage. The authorities discovered a hidden compartment in the cellar containing what they're calling a museum of deception, dozens of reproduction pieces waiting to be placed with unsuspecting victims. Inspector Slack arrived shortly after, his expression bearing the satisfaction of successful case closure. Miss Hartwell's trial has been scheduled for the spring assizes, he announced. Her cooperation has uncovered a network extending to auction houses in London, corrupt appraisers, even insurance adjusters who facilitated fraudulent claims. The scope was staggering. Miss Hartwell had created a criminal corporation, with vulnerable widows serving as unwitting operatives while she maintained careful distance from direct involvement. Only Captain Weatherby's systematic investigation had threatened to expose the entire enterprise, making his elimination a business necessity, rather than a crime of passion. What of Mrs. Blackwood's fate? Dr. Pemberton inquired with professional interest. The Crown prosecutor has agreed to reduced charges in exchange for her testimony. Slack replied with something approaching sympathy. The evidence clearly shows systematic manipulation and psychological coercion. She'll face consequences, certainly, but the court recognizes the circumstances that led to her involvement. Miss Marple reflected on this outcome with complex emotions. Mrs. Blackwood had committed murder, yet her desperation had been weaponized by someone far more calculating and dangerous. Justice must account for both actions and motivations, though the human cost of such exploitation extended far beyond what any court could address. As her visitors departed, Miss Marple contemplated the Scarlet Teapot's symbolic power. The piece had been revealed as worthless a skillful reproduction, yet it had represented security and respectability to a woman whose world was crumbling. There was profound tragedy in that deception. Evening approached with the familiar rhythms of village life continuing around her. In her sitting room, she put the kettle on her own plain brown teapot that had served honest tea for many years, and reflected that in a world of scarlet deceits and brilliant facades, simple honesty and clear observation remained humanity's surest defenses against those who would exploit weakness for profit and power. Outside her cottage windows, street Mary Mead settled into peaceful evening quiet, its tranquil facade restored but forever marked by the knowledge that even in the most innocent gatherings, human nature could reveal both its darkest depths and its capacity for justice, compassion, and ultimate redemption.